Hello and welcome to my talk, Leveling Up Your Tradecraft, How to Bolster Your Toolkit. Before we begin, a bit about myself. My name is Matthew Edderberg. I'm an engineering fellow here at Optiv. I also run our adversary simulation services. Now, this is where all our red and purple team type of engagements stem from. I've also authored numerous open source tools and frameworks. Really, a lot of my research focuses on EDR invasion, bypasses, and a lot of stuff that adversaries or nation states would focus on or deploy in a research focused manner. I'm also a Microsoft Hall of Famer related to a lot of comms security vulnerabilities and bypasses that I've disclosed over the last few years. I've spoken at numerous conferences such as DEF CON's Red Team Village and Adversary Village, DerbyCon, B-Sides Las Vegas, GERCON, RSA, and a lot more. So I'm going to kind of break down some of the topics that we're going to address here. First, understanding detection. That's the most important thing. And then kind of go into some OPSEC considerations and stuff I've learned from over the years of research and active red teaming and purple team engagements. From there, we'll kind of focus on demystifying a lot of the EDR machine learning that kind of is catching a lot of red teamers. And from that point, with that knowledge, we'll then kind of jump into some new techniques and then ultimately end up with how you can defend against these from a blue team perspective. So I always like to say payload development, it's a lot harder than it looks. To have something developed that works almost universally is very hard and is constantly something that you have to develop on. It is from my experience, I can say this from trust me, there are a lot of late nights I spend working on it, but it's very important to understand the platforms in the landscape unilaterally, not just this only works against one thing if this one value is set up. Those are great things to have, but once that thing closes off, your entire landscape is then shut down. So it really, when you're thinking about developing, and I get asked this a lot, where do I start? You want to look at everything from a even keel platform, not just, hey, this one product is susceptible to this, or I was able to do this once on X. My personal, and I say this and I want to stress this, if you truly understand the concept of defense, how the defensive measures are being placed, the optics, the sensors about that, that is your best way of understanding and developing your tooling, your toolkits, even your attack chain. It is fundamentally important that you look at defensive stuff just as equally as you do red teaming or offensive stuff. That's the only way when you balance both that you truly have a great understanding of how to be successful. So on that subject, let's start talking about some of these things. So specifically, when we look at endpoints, servers, desktops, there is always going to be some kind of endpoint detection and response mechanism these days. And that's synonymous with the industry and how it's moving. That's pretty much a de facto standard. You'll see some kind of product. We know a lot of vendors and stuff. But what are they actually doing? And the first thing that they're probably doing is they're hooking user land. This is how they get the telemetry to see any type of behavioral things. They see this process calls this and does something malicious here. They can see that in real time by these hooks. Now, there's been a lot of research. Specifically, I've even published over the past few years several white papers, toolkits, frameworks, exploiting vulnerabilities and systemic issues with userland hooks. So we'll now talk about the next evolution, which is kernel callbacks. That is the next step as we move from userland into the kernel. These are great ways to kind of still get that same telemetry, but from inside the kernel. There are some drawbacks, but for the most part, there are several products out there in that space that are living there. And from an attacker standpoint, it is extremely hard to manipulate or do anything with them because in order to do that, you need to get access to the kernel. If you have to get access to the kernel, you need some kind of signed driver that's been signed by Microsoft that has some kind of write function that you can exploit to get access to the kernel and then write to overwrite those hooks. So there's a lot of steps, and it's not that easy. Several other products have introduced other things to get secondary or other points of telemetry, such as ETW, Windows Event Tracing. This is a great way to get kind of not just the endpoint, but you can kind of gather other things that are happening outside the process, any type of traffic. It's really robust. It's actually kind of built into Windows, so you don't have to install it. You just have to enable some sort of logging and what events you're tracking and that type of stuff. And then, of course, as I mentioned, machine learning. We're going to talk a little bit more about that later. So that's what they've done. What have we done as offensive emulators, red teamers, pen testers? So process injection, moving out of our process into another one, and manipulating aspects in there. Looking at undocumented API calls that these products are not looking for, that can do the same things such as allocate memory, write to it, call the actual shellcode we want. And it's just hard. That's the cat and mouse. As new ones are developed that they can do, something such as call shellcode in a unique way. These are the ways we get around them because they're not looking specifically at that one. If everyone is looking here and you go the opposite direction, you're going to escape right by any type of detections initially. I want to stress initially, because at the end of the day, you're always going to need to have some sort of calls that allocate, that do things. And if they're watching those that are standard, they're going to see something. Block DLLs. Microsoft a long time ago introduced a flag that you can put on a process that will block any non-Microsoft DLLs. For the longest time, EDRs were not signed by Microsoft. And we'll talk more about that. So other techniques moving on, which would be introducing custom system calls. So if they're hooking system calls, such as, let's say, write process memory, and you write your own and call that, they're looking once again here, but you brought your own that does the exact same thing, and you just go around it. And there's some other advanced techniques, PE stomping, module stomping, great tools that have come out, shellcode fluctuation, and everything around sleep evasion to encrypt the stack and kind of change the permissions of your beacon or your implant, so that way when it's resting, it doesn't look like it's executable. These are things that a lot of great researchers, I could spend 15, 20 minutes listing everyone who's done some amazing work in this space. But that's really focused on in-memory avoidance. So their response to our response, first and foremost, a lot of vendors have moved to get their DLLs signed by Microsoft. So now that block DLLs, not so much valuable anymore. Also, the introduction of whitelisting controls. Microsoft has even released their own type of tooling and documentation on which processes should be allowed and shouldn't be allowed based on their research of LOL bins, LOL BAFs. Matt Lyons, another amazing consultant here at Optiv, he has a great talk about it. So if you're really interested in those type of LOL bins and whatnot, please stay tuned to take a look at his talk. But also XDR controls, looking not just at the endpoint, but the entire organization, seeing things that are outside the scope of just what's on that box or what leaves that box. Telemetry, host, traffic monitoring, taking data points from two sets can help really track what's going on if you see the same type of trend or same file or anything else, or same call out specifically to a new domain you've never seen before. That's really what that XDR really can do for you. So what can we do from an OPSEC perspective? So we've just talked about, they've evolved. So now it's our turn to evolve. And it's this kind of massive, as one evolves, we must adapt. And that's how we honestly better security in the industry. So taking a look at first, because of this block DLLs and Microsoft allowing other vendors in the EDR space to now have their DLLs signed by Microsoft, this means that this technique doesn't work. And so we have to really understand that when we're looking at post-ex specifically, we might still be detected just because we have an implant. We have a beacon, a shell, a callback. That doesn't mean we're safe. It means that we've established a foothold. But there could be not enough data points yet for enough action. But doing your next thing, such as your reconnaissance, post-ex, anything you use from that point of entrenchment may now give them enough detail that they say, we need a trigger, we need to shut down, prevent. So always keep that in mind. Just because you have that initial foothold does not necessarily mean you are free in the clear. There might be post-ex artifacts that will then trigger some type of investigation, whether that be a proactive machine-based alert that then is terminated, or enough information that an analyst reviews it and then takes manual action. Whitelisting controls. This is one of the biggest things. I want to stress this. Whitelisting controls, if done right, are one of the strongest tools a defensive or any type of team can deploy that can really shut down an attack. From a red teamer's perspective, utilizing native stuff and not bringing stuff always to the disk, like binaries, executables, that is really where we need to start focusing on more research on this. There's always going to be ways to execute that that the industry needs to use. There have been tons of research around COM objects, Office, Microsoft. We can't just shut down Microsoft's Office because it's needed for business. So what we can do is find and look for avenues to show impact on things that need to be retooled, looked at, or monitored, as well as looking at type of any external controls. I mentioned ETW, but there are ways to block these events from ever being written to ETW and thus being reviewed. There's numerous articles, in fact, on the Optiv Source Zero blog. There's some great posts about this, as well as in our GitHub. So if you're interested about some type of techniques around how to block it and stuff, please take a look at that. I'm not going to spend too much time there. So everything evolving, what can we actually do? What's like the next step to really understand and get better? So first and foremost, we have to understand where our deficiency is from a red team perspective. When we're looking at an engagement, a lot of times it's black box. So it does make it hard, but we have to, and I stress this, understand the alert and what triggered it. Oftentimes, I always hear the implant, the loader, whatever it is, it's blamed constantly. And it's not always true. I've seen probably, I want to say optimistically, 90% of the time, it's something to do with how it's being executed, some type of pre-runtime condition, or even being dropped to disk. And that's not necessarily a fault of the implant, the shell code, more of the loader, or some other types of controls. What if they, have you're dependent on, MSHTA, but they block MSHTA from being executed from low privilege users or even medium privilege users. That's not a fault of the loader. That is not a fault of the shell code. That's just honestly a fault of the operator. And that's, in that example, it's really hard to know. There's no indicators. You can't do reconnaissance on what type of whitelisting controls. So as I mentioned, LOL bins and all those types of things are really, really becoming important. And finding ones they're not necessarily net new, because when they're new, everyone focuses on. It's finding old ones that no one has ever really given attention to and trying to weaponize it. That's really where your power is. But more so, we can talk about LOL bins for a long time, but I really want to kind of stress this, which is the execution chain. Whenever I am talking to people, I always stress this. This is my own vision and how I approach building a loader and kind of my own attack chain for any organization, anything I'm trying to do, whether it be pen test, stealthy pen test, red team assessment, purple team, ransomware, you name it. We have to kind of look at these three things. The first is the delivery method. How are you getting it onto the disk? Obviously, you can't just put an exe into an email and send it over. That doesn't work. So we have to understand not only how we can get on the box, but how we can get the box without being detected and still execute. So there has to be some kind of cadence there that we have to look at and understand. And that is going to be sometimes the hardest thing to do, because again, a lot of these types of engagements we're talking about are focusing on a black box mentality, so we don't always know. Next thing, the loader. What are we dropping to disk? Obviously, you can't just drop shellcode to disk, but it's really important to focus in on what type of file. Is this a DLL, CPL, HTA, JScript, you name it. Whatever it is that contains or is going to do something that will end with our shellcode being run. The loader, I also say, is probably one of the most important things to really focus in on, because it can do things that will help increase our success, whether that be from an invasion point of view, unhooking, decrypting, even sandbox controls. But also, it focuses on anything that we need to know, such as, hey, we're going to look for a process to inject into based on the parameters you defined in it. So the more time you spend looking at modifying and building that loader, the more success when you're actually executing. Now we're talking about runtime. You'll have. The loader also is very important for pre-runtime. When it drops the disk, if you are dropping something to disk, it has to be able to stay there temporarily before it's executed. There's a lot of ways to pull stuff into memory, but a lot of those ways are heavily documented, and so therefore there's easy IOCs and detection rules. So we want to get something that kind of blends in. Everyone drops files to disks, whether it be a picture file, a little script, new executable or something like that, or shortcut, a Word document, whatever it is, it has to be able to stay on disk without triggering an alert before we even get a chance to run it. So now, the last thing, shellcode. This really is your callback to your C2. It's either shellcode or some kind of reflective loader, DLL, that is really just responsible for establishing that channel. And so if delivery, the loader are all great, there's a great chance that shellcode is going to run smoothly. That's really why we need to look at behavioral. And so to focus in on behavioral, it's not always, as I mentioned before, going to be, hey, we execute it and it's great, so that must mean we are fine. We can do whatever we want. If you execute, you have to almost think about that attack chain or execution chain to see, well, did I use a very, what I would call, dirty delivery method? Is there a good chance that now there's some kind of trigger or some kind of alert in some sort of dashboard or logging mechanism? Do I need to worry about that? Maybe maybe I got my shell back, but maybe there's some telemetry. Just because it didn't get blocked does not mean that there wasn't an alert. So we really have to understand that EDRs are not perfect. Sometimes because they look at behaviors a lot, we might have gotten, if they're looking for 3 major things or 4 major things, and we hit 2 out of 3 or 2 out of 4 or 3 out of 4, they may still have enough data points there, but there may not have been a proactive alert yet or a blocking event, but it's still on everyone's radar. And that's something to always think about, is that just because you were successful at this point does not mean that they didn't see anything else previously. It just might mean that there hasn't been enough breadcrumbs to warrant a red critical, an email, termination of the process, sort of thing like that. So it's really I always say, when you're developing this, when you're looking at your behavioral indicators, both how you got it executed, what your loader did in memory, you want to make sure you're looking at it from the concept of, is there anything in here that will get me burnt, or anything that will cause me to then have a trigger right afterwards? I've seen this many times where products, you can establish your first command after 15, 20 minutes of it calling back no alert. Your first command, boom, instant termination. And that's kind of what I like to call the fruit from the poison tree. So always keep that in mind when you're developing it. Just because it calls back doesn't mean you're in the clear. So what can we do from that implant perspective? Well, one of the easiest things to look at is, don't leave your implant or your shellcode just unmodified in your DLL, whatever it is, because it's easy to be read, it's easy to be parsed. Bytes are easy to be statically analyzed to figure it out. So encryption is always your friend. Now what I want to talk about is, more importantly, when we talk about encryption, base 64, XORing, that is obfuscation, not encryption. There's no substitution for encryption. I hear a lot of people say, well, I'm going to make my own encryption model, or I'm going to do this and this and this. If you are making your own encryption, it's not going to work. I have yet to see someone develop their own encryption scheme and deploy it successfully. It just doesn't work. If it works once, next week, it's not going to work. And you need something tried and true. So, AES, any types of those types of encryption, hell, even RC4 is better than just base 64 encoding or XORing your shellcode. Next thing, strings. Strings, this is really where it comes down to that layer of on disk, as well as sometimes in memory, sometimes with behaviors. Strings are sometimes really hard to strip out, manipulate, or something like that. But luckily, because of all the open source community, you can actually look at, just by Googling Yaras, what defenders are looking at. When I say this, I don't mean this to say, hey, go use this as a way to cheat, but it can always be improved. When I go back to that cat and mouse sort of structure, we want to actually help. So if there's some easy things that you can manipulate in those Yara rule strings that they're looking for, then also break it. That's a great proof of concept to show impact. To now say, hey, let's go back and reinvent that wheel because I now got around it. So it's helping it, that cat and mouse game to always evolve to make that stronger detection. Another great thing, I'm a big believer in this, is that using uncommon languages just adds layer of obfuscation. What I mean by that is, like, if you're a Go or a Rust fan, you know this already. That language is those files that you create because of those languages is a lot harder to detect than, say, like a PowerShell or C++ file. So talked about the implant. Now let's kind of talk about that loader. And again, I cannot stress this enough. Understanding what controls are in place. Yes, someone's going to say, but it's black box. I don't know all this stuff. You have to get as much information. This is where your OSINT comes into play. The more information you have, the more you know. And this might involve even doing some pretexting calls if they are in scope, calling up the users, pretending to IT, talking, getting some information. Once you have that, it helps you build it up. Understanding the file, the attributes, and how it looks on disk, that's very mindful. It's something to be mindful of. I always say, from an analyst point of view, KGTX25ZWX.exe, or naming it after a famous framework, such as, like, let's just say scarecrow.exe or loader.exe, stands out more than, say, Outlook or CMD. Also, I see this a lot. Binaries are constantly the focal points. Binaries are what I like to call very dirty. They're very easy to detect. There are tons of different files and different methods to execute those types of files that are going to go around it just natively because these products are not looking for it. So always keep that in mind, that a binary shouldn't always be your first lever to pull. Also, on the subject of, your shellcode and stuff, when you encrypt it, you're going to have to do something to it to make it, writable or readable. So that's kind of where, base64 XORing does come into play. But having these large blobs can be very, obvious. So I always recommend breaking these up into smaller strings and scattering them across your tool. Having some kind of a logic there that will then rebuild it all up once it runs in memory adds those layers to that loader. Moving on. So now we'll talk actually about machine learning. So machine learning has always been synonymous these days with security products. It's kind of their secret sauce, to be honest. And when we try to understand, going back to my mission statement about you have to understand the defensive side as equally as the offensive side, when it's kind of under proprietary information, it makes it harder for us to understand gaps that we can show impact to improve. Remember, this is all not to kind of show that anything is deficient or inferior, but to find these things. As security professionals, we're always looking in that mindset of being malicious and thinking outside the box in ways that others haven't, and showing impact of why there needs to be some type of life cycle improvement. So looking at this, we can actually kind of understand that machine learning kind of creates a problem in this space if there is not a clear understanding of what it's alerting on, and it's just some vague terminology. And that's honestly the truth, because when we're trying to improve and look at stuff, or we're trying to explain how we got around it in a type of engagement, if it's kind of like, hey, we saw this from machine learning, but we didn't see this, why? We can't, as subject matter experts, say for sure why, because we don't have all the data points, and that makes it really hard to do our job to then help clients. So here's some actual behavioral indicators and alerts from other products that rely a little less on what I would call the secret sauce machine learning. You can see right here, there's very important data points, such as, whether or not it is signed, the things that are mapped to MITRE. So you can see right here, they're identified, there was an action against LSAS. There was some type of evasion here. There was an injection method. You can see at the bottom right here in this other product that they had done several things related to permission modifications and stuff like that. So right here, you can actually start looking at the types of indicators on what caused that alert to understand what they saw and what they didn't see. And from there, we can start making that understanding and shining a light on that gap to bridge the two together. And that's really important. So this is what I kind of really say what machine learning sometimes can be, unfortunately. It is not this machine big brain AI going. It's usually just logic and if else statements and patterns and recognitions. But it's still very effective, and I don't want to disparage that at all. it just has some issues. I mean, a lot of times machine learning either is, on disk when an implant or loader gets dropped to disk, or at runtime. And it could really, what it does is it does pre-runtime checks before it gets executed, um, looking for stuff. This could be, hey, this file's age is too short. This file doesn't meet the prevalence. It has some strings that we know are known for malicious actors. It's, from the pre-run, we found that there is attributes missing that it's trying to pretend to be. There's tons of things like that. So there's value there, but it's not what it's marketed as. I want to stress that. So I'm going to try to use an example. This came from an actual live engagement. So dropping a loader to disk, this alert occurred. You can see right here, operation did not occur because there's some kind of potentially unwanted software or a virus. Nothing from the perspective of this loader happened that would be the EDR unhooking techniques being detected, any type of module or thread spoofing or any of those advanced techniques that we kind of alluded to. Something in the file was present that actually showed, hey, this is known to be malicious or something that needs to be investigated. And that's really what I'm talking about when we talk about machine learning and all this stuff. That happens. Now, we don't know what that string is. It wasn't a MITRE, something that can be mapped to it, or even a behavioral thing like, hey, this thing is going to touch LSS, because there's no way to do that. We don't know that, once again, because it's behind some kind of secret sauce. So instead, because this was against an actual kernel level EDR, that file did not work. But taking that same file, hosting it remotely, and using the command mshta to download it into memory, that same script file that we saw before, worked. Why? Because we circumvented the disk. And without that, those pre-runtime, those checks for strings, all that stuff were not being looked at in memory. And so those static disk scanners never triggered any suspicious alerts. Let's talk about static signatures, or strings, I like to call them. When we're looking at these things, you can kind of see from this picture right here, taken from FireEye against APT34, that one of the things that they were looking at was this Go build ID. This was based off a Go malware piece. So you can actually see that these are strings that are constant or uniform across all of them to detect. So when we talk about a disk or a file or anything like that on disk being dropped and then an alert happening, these are some of the things that they look at. Hey, does this file contain these things that we know are known to be malicious? And it seems very weird that in this era that we're looking at this with all the in-memory behavioral stuff. But the reason is it's still very effective. At the end of the day, I've talked about this many times in some white papers and stuff. Nothing is truly fileless. There's always going to be some artifacts or something like that. And if there are, you can look at strings, and if they're similar, that's when you can start building some really simple rudimentary detections to be built on later down the road. And when I'm talking about this, we're going to move on from this point on to really kind of focus in on like the Go Rust payloads, specifically Go. I'm a huge fan of Go. So a lot of these examples are going to be based on this, but it'll kind of show and illustrate the point of how just some of these techniques we're going to be doing to manipulate and avoid them are so effective. So when we talk about detecting based on strings like that Go one, they are great, as I mentioned, but there are some unintended downsides. First and foremost, when doing this, you're going to introduce some false positives. Go has become such a synonymously used programming language with malware authors because of how effective it is and how powerful it is, easily obfuscated and everything else like that. It kind of creates a lot of false positives to the point that new versions of Go are instantly being flagged by Windows Defender, even just like the install files and stuff. And you can kind of see that here. In fact, right now, a lot of times they're working when they release a new version of Go to get it, whitelisted in there, which for me, that's quite humorous, but also a little sad from how the triage, because there shouldn't be that many static detection points that triggers on a clean vanilla install of a language. But from the point of attackers use obfuscation and encryption stuff, there are always going to be strings that they can't manipulate or change. And that's really where the focus is on, that those, while there's obfuscation stuff and make some type of entropy or uniqueness, there are always going to be artifacts, headers, anything like that that's going to be able to be zoned in on. And especially in like languages like Go, where there's a lot of extra code added, extra things because of how it's compiled. Those are really what's been focused in on by the industry as ways to detect it. And that is a great thing, but also creates problems, as we can see. So we're not going to use two test cases for the next set of demonstrations. These are both Golang-based payloads written from an old framework I developed years and years ago. And all this framework really does is it just loads shell code onto the stack and executes it. There's no advanced techniques, there's no PE stomping, there's no unhooking or anything else. It just does straight up that. Okay. So what can we do? Well, if we look at those common strings and we can't really avoid them, but we can maybe manipulate them because those strings are natively baked into the build, what happens? Well, we can avoid things, right? Is this possible even? The answer is yes, but it really goes down to how we manipulate. Because when we talk about manipulating a compiled made file, not just code and then compiling it, we're talking about something that's been compiled and we know it's going to work, and changing anything in it could cause some breaking or the file just to crash. So there are some rules we have to understand first when we talk about starting to manipulate or strip any of these types of things. First and foremost, anything that we manipulate, if we're going to take like a block, we have to manipulate it so that way the size never changes. The other major kind of component we have to understand here is that we cannot manipulate names of functions or strings once they're compiled. That would cause issues, mapping, and essentially a fault seg. So there is issues there, and especially when we're talking about manipulation and increasing size or shrinking it, that would create a misalignment in the file. So we're really kind of limited in what we can do, but it's still quite powerful. So we can see right here, using that same example of that Yara rule, that go build ID. Remember, that's what they were alerting on. So we change the exact string length of bytes and say change it from that to just a. We're not manipulating the function name, but we are manipulating something that they're looking at. So when we do this with those two files, we can see that all of a sudden, very old, previously these files weren't being able to even be dropped to disk without being alerted. Now they can be executed. But we see something else now when we run them. Because of the machine learning, they can't see those strings. So it goes to the next phase. And that next phase is sandboxing in this case. So we can see that this is called home, and you can see these two processes have a weird name, which is really funny if you think about this. And then I want to kind of put this out there. And this will be something that down the road, maybe you'll see me release. But looking at this, if we just do a SHA-256 hash of the file, we can see that the first half of the hash is that file name. So we went from very old code that couldn't be dropped to disk, there's known IOCs and alerts, to all of a sudden stripping a few things out. Now the next thing happened, which is sandboxing, because they couldn't figure it out. There was maybe some heuristics here. They weren't sure. So it now went from being able to drop to disk to runtime. So this is really where we want to focus in on that. There are static artifacts or indicators that are built in that when removed, manipulated, products like a CrowdStrike or any EDR doesn't have enough telemetry to look at this and deem that this is malicious and determine it. So they kind of move it into a sandbox because there's something suspicious here. So we've now moved the needle in our success point. I also want to just once again stress, we just did this without doing anything that you would see like AMZ patching, ETW, unhooking the EDR, sandbox evasion, module stomping, any of these things. All we did was look at the file in hex, and manipulate some of those known strings that everyone's looking at. We can also do something else, which is really cool. When we talk about EDRs as a whole, there is a systemic type of issue that I have identified, where just by adding and inflating the file, as I like to say, beyond 100 megs, all these products, whether it be userland or kernel, they don't scan. They don't look at these files because they're too large. Why, you might ask? Well, the problem is that when you load something that big into memory and you start to scan it, you have to pause almost the execution for a second or two to make sure beforehand, like we kind of talked about, pre-runtime it checks, and then we got around it, and then now there's a sandbox. So when you're looking at that, the larger the file, the longer it takes. Now, a product does not want to hold up the user's experience, because unfortunately, if your product slowed down users by a few seconds or something noticeable, people are going to complain. And that's unfortunately the crux of a lot of security: security, cost, and functionality for the user. And at the end of the day, Sally from accounting just really wants to open up her files. She doesn't like the fact that everything is being super locked down and secure. So there's this balance. And so by inflating, just by using a few lines of code, we can actually add enough zeros to increase the file. So this doesn't actually change anything because we're adding it to the end. There's no additional data because there's zeros, but it increases it to a large file size that it cannot be read or scanned, which means that we can then establish it, shellcode, beacon, callback, implant, whatever you want to name it, without triggering an alert or preventative measure. And we don't need to unhook or do any of those advanced techniques. So with that, I would like to introduce Mangle. This is a new tool, and I'll have the link to it on the Optiv GitHub at the end. But at a very high level, it does all these things we've been talking about. So first and foremost, it does strip out all those known static strings and indicators. Right now, it only does Go. But down the road, as I grow this tool and with updates, I want to include C++, C#, Rust, you name it. And I always will look for the community to help me out with that. So if you have any known ones, feel free to hit me up, and I'll gladly introduce them in. It clones actual valid code signing certs, which is very different than another tool I have, which is called Limelighter. We're going to talk about that in a second, but it also uses that technique of inflating files. Now, you can actually specify with this how large the file you want to inflate. So if you want to just inflate 60 megs or 150, you don't have to stick to 100. So this will be a toolkit that will be released with the intent that it augments your current loader or implant. It is not going to generate them for you, so you already have to have your implant ready to go. But this will utilize the techniques we've just been talking about over the past little while. As for this code signing cert, I know everyone's going to say, Matthew, Limelighter, what's the difference? The difference here is that this one actually takes legitimate code signing certs from legitimate files and copies them over. Limelighter actually just takes a domain and creates a fake self-signed cert and then signs it. This will actually take the full chain, the time it was signed, and all the proper dates and copy them over. So Limelighter, it will just show the day that you created that file. That's when the signed date would be. But this one actually will take the date, even if it's 3 or 4 or a year ago. Those values will be there. So everything will be valid short of it actually being checked out, which just helps push the envelope in that story. You can kind of see this right here. So on the left-hand side, you'll see an example from Limelighter. So you see Cisco, you can see the sign date and everything else this year. And there's no countersign measures and all this stuff. Here, we took a file called legit.exe, signed it with a valid code signing cert, have all the signing dates and all the digital certificate information right there. And you can see it's from 2021. So that really does show that we can just take all these values and move it forward to really just push that envelope of things to blend in, those indicators that I was talking about before. Because, security products, if they see a file that was signed and dropped and everything else less than a day or a week, that's kind of suspicious for something that was signed a year ago. So what would be a great story without a great demo? So first and foremost, we'll kind of show. So this is that Go Evade framework where it's been inflated. So we can see that it's 152 megs. So it's a lot larger than your typical implant, even for Go. And when we see it, it gets executed, calls back home, no questions. And then we can interact and run commands without any issues. See response, no problems, no termination, no unhooking, no nothing needed. What's really interesting about this is that this does work even on kernel EDRs, because it's all a systemic issue of what they will look at and how big and that convenience factor. So here we have a known kernel EDR, same file that we just executed. We'll kind of confirm, you can see the size, 152. And then once it's executed, we have established a callback. And of course, we can interact without it being terminated or any alerts popping up on the screen. So how do you defend against this? Well, especially around this inflate, the truth is that there are hardly any executables, DLLs or binaries in the system in Windows that are over 30 megs. If they are, they're typically found in one of two places: System32 or in the program files. So when you talk about how do you prevent this, you need to start looking at your detections and where things are being executed, because at the end of the day, a large 100 or file that's dropped to the temp folder, that should be a red flag right there. An executable in the temp file as well. But places like a desktop or any place where a user that doesn't have elevated privileges is running files. So that could be the temp, app data, you name it. The desktop, their downloads, their my pictures, documents. There shouldn't be large files there that are executable. So right there, that should be a cadence. Tuning your alerts to that can help definitely defeat and quickly alert on this inflatable technique. The techniques with strings, you're always going to have this cat and mouse where you're developing and looking at how to improve those strings. So don't ever look at that concept as a bypass. It is only just how can we improve those string-based detections? Because as this comes out, I encourage people, the security researchers, defenders, to look at it and kind of how can we now get around this or detect this, as I should say. Because that's how we improve the security posture of everyone. As for code signing certs and everything else, that is always going to be a big battle. I would say, honestly, look at the whole sum of the picture. Don't just look at the attributes of the file. They can be useful, but when you start looking at that, you need to start looking at the chain. How did that file get onto disk, as we said before? Going back to that life cycle, the loader, the execution, and the implant. If you're looking at the loader, how did that loader get on disk? What does that loader contain? Then looking at behavioral stuff. With all those things, you can start to see that whole picture and make those detections. Then it's just a matter of automating it for you and your team. EDRs and security products, they're definitely looking at these things. It's just there are a million things. And they have to slowly do one after another. So once again, defending against this is going to be a long, arduous process. As things develop, new strings are discovered, the manipulation of those or bypassing of those come into play. And I want to stress this more than anything. This isn't a failure of EDRs. This isn't a failure of anything. This just is an opportunity to improve the posture of the current state. Honestly, where I hear a lot about, well, I want to move from this product to this one because it didn't detect X or Y, that's the wrong thing. If you rely on one single product as your main point of protection, that's already a recipe for failure for your organization. You need to look at a layered defensive strategy where you have multiple different things that overlap, because there's no one perfect product that's going to be your silver shield that covers the entire landscape. There's always going to be gaps and little blind spots, but having a layered approach with other products that kind of shine light into that gaps or into those shadows of those areas where adversaries kind of like to live, create a smaller attack surface, making it harder. And because it's always black box, we never know until there's noise. Ultimately, everything I've talked about here, especially this toolkit, can be also it can be stopped, not so much circumvented, but prevented by implementing some kind of strong whitelisting controls. And that's why I say whitelisting is extremely important. It's one of the single most key things for an organization to start looking at here. EDRs, proactive and defensive, alerts, SIM, SOC, they're all great. But if I can't run malicious stuff on your system, I've already lost. And that's where whitelisting controls come into play. Because I can't scan for them. I don't know the policies. Without doing this, without actually physically getting access to the box, taking it, almost taking a look at it, trying to really almost divine, reverse, execute stuff to see, I have no clue what will work, what won't work. So by implementing something like this, I know it's an arduous process, but the return is astronomical. With that, I want to kind of turn it over for questions. You can find these slides on my personal GitHub, as well as the tool on the Optiv GitHub. If you have any questions, you can feel free to reach out to me on Twitter or GitHub. But I want to say thank you for listening to my talk, and have a great day, everyone.